Hello and welcome back to the Wheel Knowers Formula One podcast. It's just Josh today, usually joined by my co-host Sam, but he is out right now on vacation, actually over in Europe. Didn't get to go to the race, but is having a great time over there. So it's just a solo episode today, just Josh here. We're going to be breaking down a lot from a pretty eventful Austrian Grand Prix. So yeah, let's get right into it. George Russell back on the top step for the first time since Australia, now only down 40 points in the championship. I think this is kind of the exact race that he needed, to be honest. No issues, just using his strengths of knowledge and consistency to outduel his young opponent in Antonelli. I think it could be a real tide turning point for the championship. And yeah, this just felt like, it's exactly what George was looking for in a race weekend, one where he seemed at least the equal driver and, comes out on top with a win, which, last time out in Barcelona, he obviously finishes ahead of his teammate. Granted, there were some different circumstances there. Obviously, Antonelli going out of the race with some issues, some car issues, right after he had passed George on track to, retake position and actually gain points on him in the championship. This time, that isn't the case. George just does it all on track. And, like I said last time out, he finishes ahead, but he doesn't win the race. And I think a win like this is what he needed, where we'll get to Antonelli soon, but he's kind of having some issues all throughout the race, especially in the beginning, and George is just holding on from pole, not making any mistakes, doing exactly what he needed to do. So felt like this is the race that George was kind of looking for to get his season turned around. And yeah, I think that this could be a big turning point in the championship if he can keep this momentum up. I still think Antonelli looked a bit quicker, just on pure pace. But George, without, not having the mistakes, just being the more consistent driver, managing the race from out front, doing all those types of things, I think that's the type of weekend he needed to really settle down into this championship and get some forward momentum going. So I think that could be big and could be what we're, seeing going forward is George putting in more performances like this. That being said, the weekend wasn't without its, issues, its controversy for George. He had that Quali yellow flag moment where Max has just put it in the wall coming into the last two turns there of the lap. George, he's coming through. There's a yellow on the boards on the side, and he just lifts just barely, just enough. And, still has a time that's fast enough to put him on pole. A lot of controversy around that. Should George's lap have counted? Should it have been a double yellow? Did George just kind of get handed that Quali pole? And, to me, I don't think George did anything wrong. He actually played the situation very smartly, did exactly what he needed to do in that situation, knowing the rules and using them to his advantage, actually. Just lifting just enough there to where he could say he lifted and, was observant of the yellow, but not enough to where it really affected his lap a ton. And he did get lucky a bit that it was going into a turn where he was already going to have, at least a little bit of lift anyways. So it really didn't have that much an effect on his lap time, which was, good for George. But it obviously created a lot of controversy around should that pole have stayed. But yeah, I think George, he didn't do anything wrong there, played that very smartly and did what he needed to do in that situation to take advantage of the rules and, continue on with that eventual lap that was good enough for pole. The issue, though, I think should be on the FIA for not throwing the double yellow there when Max has clearly just had a big incident. He's off in the corner, in the gravel up against the wall there, where if George comes through or another driver comes through on a push lap, even if they lift a little bit, there's still a chance where they could have a moment there and do the exact same thing, go into Max, who's, sitting there, in his car. He's not motionless, but in his car that is motionless, just sitting on the side of the road. So, that was a big moment in safety where I think the FIA just got it wrong. They needed to throw double yellows there, as Max was in a very vulnerable position. I think it was unsafe to allow cars to go through there quickly, even if there was, a little lift like we saw from George. He did lift. Like I said, nothing against George here, did exactly what he needed to do. I just think the FIA handled it very poorly. And at the very least, I think that there does need to be some looking into in terms of the whole just lifting for a yellow flag thing, because it's not really, if there's a yellow flag out, obviously that means that, there's an issue on track that drivers need to be aware of. And just barely lifting to say you lifted isn't really playing into the full breadth of, what we're actually trying to accomplish with the yellow, which is to keep everybody safe in that situation, and to just have a safe area on track when someone's just had an incident or their car stranded on the side of the road or whatever. So I think the FIA needs to do some looking into with that yellow flag rule, where just barely lifting is enough to say that you have done what you needed to do. But if they're not going to do that, situations like this need to be double yellows pretty immediately, because I don't think that was, for as much as the FIA preaches safety and stuff, I don't think they were putting their drivers in the safest situation by allowing that to play out the way it did. Let's go to Max now, because he had a great race, in my opinion, a very good drive up from P5 to P2. Just a really solid showing from him after what went down in Quali, which was not great. But you got to ask if Red Bull left some on the table there with the strategy call of letting Russell rebuild that gap in the final pit stops there, where Max has gotten that gap down to, about a second, maybe a little over a second, back to George in front of him. And then George comes into the pits. They elect to leave Max out a little bit longer to try and build that, the tire advantage to have later on in the race, which, to their credit, almost did work out. But it has to be said that at that time, it felt like Max had the advantage. He had the momentum in that race, and you just allowed George to rebuild that buffer, rebuild that gap, where you're just going to make it harder for Max to take advantage of that situation. I think they should have followed very closely after Mercedes, or even jumped Mercedes in the pits to get Max on a little bit of fresher tires. And possibly undercut him and, take the advantage there, when it seemed like tire deg was a pretty big deal in that race with the temperatures and everything else. It just felt like Red Bull missed the mark on that one. And I would say they left some on the table for Max to get the win today, because he just, they had it right there. They were close enough to make the jump and, at least put the pressure on Russell for the last 20 or 30 laps of the race. Instead, they let George just kind of get out there and build a nice comfy gap, that he can just use towards the end. So I think Red Bull could have done something different there. I think they could have put the pressure on George and seen if there were any cracks in the armor there, when it looked like Max was also just faster on pace throughout. So you could have used that to your advantage as well, obviously making the move on track with Max and his faster pace in the race. So just felt like Red Bull might have made a bit of a mistake there. But, at the same time, Max left some on the table as well with that Quali crash. I think he could have won without that, maybe qualifying P3 somewhere in there. Definitely would have qualified ahead of where he did in P5 without crashing there. And, when the end of the race comes down to a second or two, that obviously can make the difference, just starting a couple places back and having to fight through that traffic. I think that Max left some on the table as well. So it's worth calling that out, where it's not all in Red Bull as a team. I think Max, hurt himself, obviously, by having that Quali crash. And it really hurt his chances at coming away with a win in the race on Sunday. But speaking, I mean, we had some incredible Max and Hamilton moments, just some vintage moments between those two, side by side. Throughout half a lap there, and just battling for multiple laps. And Hamilton is on the inside there in that middle sector of the lap, and he kind of runs Max a little bit wide, where Max fans could say that warranted a penalty. Max was off track, but it wasn't by much, and I think that was really just hard racing between those two. I'm glad they didn't throw a penalty there, and I mean, at the end of the day, Hamilton just didn't have the pace to keep up with Max in the end, so really didn't end up mattering too much. It might have cost Max out once again on a little bit of time, which, like we said, he needed just a second or two there in the end to win the race. So, something like that could have helped out, but I don't think it was egregious enough from Hamilton to come away with the penalty. I actually just loved the racing between those two. It felt like the good old days in 2021 where those two were just, going at it. And I like it when, the guys are getting their elbows out and fighting hard. I don't think that there was too much of an issue with that one there between those two guys. I thought it was really fun racing. And this race as a whole had some really great racing, actually, that, we've obviously had our issues with this, generation of car. But there's been some good racing the past few races here since they made those changes in Miami. I think we'd all still like to see more changes. But the racing has been pretty solid these last few races. So, you got to commend the FAA and Formula One for making some changes there. Give them a little bit of props for that, certainly. Let's go to your championship leader now, Kimi Antonelli. To me, it was the first race since Australia where it feels like he was not the dominant force of the race. Whether that was, through car issues, you mentioned a long brake pedal, or just mistakes that he was making himself. I mean, we saw that at the beginning. It could have been from the long brake pedal. It could have just been mistakes that, driver errors there when he went off a few times at the beginning of the race, and just kind of opened the door there for some opportunities for other guys to get ahead of him, obviously, and kind of just, hurt himself by making those errors early on in the race. I love him, being aggressive. I think that's why he's a really appealing driver to a lot of fans. I certainly am appealed to watching that. But when you compare it with George, he maybe had a mistake in the race, but other than that, it was very solid. And that's what I was talking about earlier with George. Just having that kind of race is what he needed. Where Antonelli in the first 5 laps just kind of looks all over the place. And that pushed him back in the order to where later on, when he had great pace, it just wasn't enough to make up that gap to George, which I think really, really cost him. Either way, whether it's through car issues or just too many mistakes, I think it's definitely worth noting. I'm not going to freak out about it yet. It's just one race. Obviously, the pace still looked good in the end. The pace came back to him in the second half of the race, but those issues, I think, arguably cost him the race, if not certainly second place, just with that time loss that you look at going off a couple times. Would have put him ahead of Max, I think, and maybe ahead of George. You never know, because he definitely had the pace later on in the race to fight for a win there. Just the mistakes got him, and those are things that a young guy's going to make when being aggressive like that, trying to make up. I think Toto said it after the race as well, just, trying to make up the positions and take the lead in the first couple of laps there, starting from P4. Probably feels like he got left out by that yellow flag situation as well, where he aborted his lap because of it. Felt like he probably deserved to be up there closer, wanted to get that back in the beginning. And, those are just things that he's going to have to learn, that you can make that time up just with solid pace throughout, obviously being aggressive where you need to, but not being overly aggressive in the first couple laps. They say you can't win the race in the first lap, but you can lose it. I'm not sure he didn't do anything egregious, but he definitely didn't do himself any favors in those first couple laps. I think that really hurt Kimi and his chances for the win. And another thing that hurt his chances for the win, I liked how they were talking about it on the broadcast of, he wasn't unlucky. He just didn't get the luck of these safety cars coming out. Both safety cars or VSCs came out right after he was going into, or it came out a lap after he went into the pits. If he would have waited one more lap on either of those, he could have, had a shortened up pit stop there compared to the rest of the field in terms of time loss. And, that obviously could have helped him in the end get a win or a second place. But, it wasn't meant to be on either of those occasions. And I did like how they said he wasn't unlucky. He just didn't get the luck that he needed there. He didn't get lucky. And yeah, I think that obviously it sucked for Kimi. And it probably had to, be pretty painful for him and his side of the garage to see that both times. But there wasn't either time where it looked like on one of those, Kimi may have been able to squeeze in right before, but looking back, and they said this on the broadcast as well, that there wouldn't have been enough time to get him in and call him in with just the timing of how those things fell. So it's unfortunate for Kimi to not get that luck, but yeah, he wasn't unlucky in that sense either. Let's move to Ferrari now. I really want to kind of focus on them. They didn't have the pace out there this week in Austria. Obviously last time out, Hamilton gets the win. He looks very fast. And props to Hamilton and his side of the garage for trying some things on strategy, but they just didn't have the pace. I mean, they looked pretty far off, just kind of miserable on some of those tires out there. Both of their guys having to do, I think, an extra stop compared to the rest of the field to try and just do something different. And it didn't end up working. Starting P2 and P3, and on top of that, coming into the weekend with some more upgrades that they were bringing, even more than what they brought last week, where they really propelled them forward. It just wasn't enough, and it actually seemed like they were further from Mercedes, obviously, this week than they were last time out. So don't know what they're going to have to look over there. It could be track specific, that their car just isn't really suited for here. I mean, I think that's obviously fair. We know they're better in some of the slower speed corners. There's less of those at Austria, at the Red Bull Ring. There's a lot of straight line speed that Mercedes and Red Bull, kind of thrive in, where Ferrari, they just don't have that kind of straight line speed in their car. So, you got to look at that as well when you're looking at why Ferrari were so far off the pace. But they had somewhat of pace, at least in quali, to be P2 and P3, probably P3 and P4 if Kimi had gotten his lap in fully. So I just think that in terms of race pace, they were off, and seemed like their car just was not nice to their tires, which was something to definitely take away from this race and to look at for future races for Ferrari, where they're still trying to hold on and maybe make a final chance at getting into this Constructors Championship fight. I think Mercedes is going to run away with it, but right now they still have a chance at it if they can make the upgrades. And this weekend was a little bit of a step back, and especially for Charles too. He looks, way further off the pace than Hamilton. He outqualified him, but then in the race just looked very, very slow compared to Hamilton. Hamilton, I'd say probably since Miami, has looked a lot better with the car than Charles has. He's had some other issues along the way in those races that haven't helped. But yeah, just not quite looking on the same level as his teammate. Obviously, the points show that out as well. But you would have thought it would be closer, especially in the first few races where it seemed like it was, head to head. They were, right there battling each other. And they were going to be all season, but it seems like Hamilton has really taken the advantage in this Ferrari championship, or this Ferrari head-to-head battle. And I think that is worth noting, that Charles looks to be off the pace right now. And, we're going to have to keep an eye out on that going forward, if Charles has anything for Hamilton this year and can make a punchback in the head-to-head there. Let's move to Williams now. Williams, man, I think they're in shambles. They're down pretty bad right now. P17 for Albon, 2 laps down. He even finished one lap down from Ocon, while Sainz DNFs with car issues. We talked previously about how this was supposed to be their year. 2026 was supposed to be their big year, right? The past few years, where Vowles is saying everything we're doing is for 2026. The break everything a few years ago to their young drivers before Sargent was replaced with Sainz, and for a little bit Colapinto as well. But just giving their drivers the freedom to push and try and make those changes, because everything that they're building is for 2026. And then to come out in 2026 like this, after Vowles constantly is talking about how 2026 is going to be their year, and just all the effort that they were going to put into it, and then to come out this lackluster is just not really acceptable, in my opinion. To make such a big deal about it, and to say that you've been working for years on this 2026 car, and just building the team for this year, and then to come out like this, where obviously you start the year, you're behind at the Barcelona test, the shakedown, you're very overweight with the car, and then to never really look like you're even close to the top of the midfield. They're a step ahead of the likes of Cadillac and Aston Martin right now, but to be there with where Cadillac and Aston Martin are, that's not where you wanted to be if you were Williams, having all this talk about how it's all going to play out in 2026, and then to be pretty solidly the P9 team on the grid right now, between them and Audi. And Audi's a brand new team, so that just kind of shows you where Williams is at the moment. And it's not where they were supposed to be. It's not where they wanted to be. And, to be honest, that's not where they should be at this moment, with the drivers they have, with the team principal that I still believe in and I still think is capable of bringing them to where they want to be. And some of the personnel they have too. They have a very nice group of people working over there. It's just not acceptable, and they know that. And obviously they're not where they want to be. But if they want to hold on to these drivers, I think they have the best driver lineup in the midfield, certainly. And it's, on par, I think, if you give them the right car with, some of the top 4 teams up there. So they have a driver lineup that shouldn't be fighting in this position, where you're, Albon's P17 and in this race, and, a lot of races they haven't really looked close. So yeah, if they want to keep that driver lineup, if they don't want to fall back to where they were a few years ago, they need to make big changes, and they need to show it by the end of the year. They're not going to be fighting for podiums by the end of the year by any stretch, but they need to show a significant improvement in terms of pace and where they are on the grid, if they don't want to fall back there. And I don't think anybody wants Williams to fall back there. They're a very historic team on the grid. And we want to see them, be successful. At least I do. I think it's better off for the sport if Williams is a successful team, fighting for decent points, if not eventually podiums and wins. And yeah, I just think that with where they were talking up 2026 to be, I think it's not really acceptable for them to be where they are right now. But I still want to give them some time to get there. I think they have till the end of 2026 to prove something, to show something. And I think that they need that for their drivers, for their sponsors, and to keep some personnel around as well. So yeah, I just think Williams are in a bad spot, but I still think it's doable for them to come out of 2026 on a positive note if they make the changes that they need to. Let's go to Cadillac Corner now. Obviously, we are the premier Cadillac podcast, F1 podcast out there. We love to just check in on our boys every week, every race. I think, you could say the Monaco thing was the worst weekend yet, just based on how crushing it was to have the first points of the team stripped away when Perez, made those mistakes on the start and the restart, just being out of position. But I would have to say that this is the worst weekend yet, just as a whole, since they've come onto the grid this year. Double DNF for both drivers in just the first few laps. They were both out of the race. Multiple issues in practice as well. where Perez, he doesn't make it through FP1 or FP2 without major issues that, he didn't really get much running in at all in those first two practice sessions. Bottas had some issues as well in those practice sessions that hindered him. And, with the big upgrades they brought this weekend, I think they brought like 10 upgrades or something. It was supposed to be a big weekend for them in terms of improvement and getting closer to the midfield. And in the small times that we got to see it, I think we did see some of that where, Bottas looked, I think it was P13 and FP1. And, the two drivers, I think they were 1.8 and 1.9 seconds off the pace in Quali in Q1. So they were closer to the midfield on pace. They just never got to show it because they had too many issues with the car, and ultimately were not able to actually get any real meaningful running in. So we'll see how next week goes for them at Silverstone. I hope that they're able to show some of that the improvements in their car, because I do think it's going to be an improved car. They just need to have the durability out there to show those off. And I'm not sure if it's just random and it was just everything kind of coming in at once this weekend where they had all these issues, or it was because of the upgrades to the car that these issues were coming in. But they needed to get it figured out before Silverstone, because they need to get some solid running in just to see the data on these new upgrades and figure out where they need to go from here. This whole season is about just getting the running in for Cadillac. And if they can't do that, but because of, these issues and reliability issues, then that's going to be a big problem for them. So for them to be where they need to be by the end of the year, which I think is, within striking distance of like the Williams and Haas teams of the world, they need to get that running in, and hopefully they can do that next weekend, because this weekend just didn't allow for it for them. And it was a tough weekend for them in that aspect. I think it was the worst weekend yet for Cadillac since coming onto the grid because of all those issues. Let's get to our personal podiums now, or at least just one personal podium for me, since it's just me this weekend. We got Max Verstappen in P1 for me. I went back and forth between Max and George for that P1 spot, but I had to give it to Max. Coming back after the crash in Quali with, a great race to start P5, get up to P2. I think he was the fastest driver out there on the day. You could obviously bump him down further in how you feel like he did this weekend, because obviously that crash set him back, like we mentioned earlier. But in terms of just the race, I think that he definitely was probably the best out there and did the most with the car that he had. In P2, I have George Russell. Talked a little bit about him at the beginning, but I just think it was, a really good race for him, and it was the weekend that he needed to have to just find that comfortability and ease in the championship, to where it doesn't feel like everything is going against him. And he finally finishes a race since Australia where he doesn't get passed by Kimi on track, or, doesn't lose out to Kimi just on pure pace. So I think this is the weekend that he needed. This is, it was a very solid weekend for George, and I don't really have too much else to say other than this is what he needed, and it was a really good race for him. In third, thought about doing Antonelli here, but I didn't want to have just the normal podium be my personal podium, and I think this driver deserves it as well. So I'm with Oscar Piastri. Didn't really show like crazy pace or anything, but he was just steady out there with no mistakes, making his way up to P4, just outside the podium positions, while his teammate started ahead of him and finished back in 7th. I'm not sure what was going on with Norris in that race. Austria has been a good track for him in the past, and it just seemed like he didn't have it out there. So it was definitely, tough on his side. But for Oscar, I think that just shows that it was a very solid race for him. And the McLarens, they're still not quite there on pace. I think that they're getting some upgrades, in a few races time, and that'll be much needed for them. We know that they're good at upgrading their car, throughout the season, just based on the past 4 or 5 years. And I think that they need that to get back battling for wins and podiums this year. And stinker of the week, let's go. I don't want to do it to them. We just praised them last week about how good they've been this year. I know Sam's probably going to get on me with this because I'm going after Alpine when he's not here. But I got to go with Alpine for stinker of the week. I think it's been, it was their worst weekend of the year, their worst result of the year with the P13 and P15 finishes for their two drivers. Their closest midfield competitors, meanwhile, in Racing Bulls finished 9th and 10th. I still think they're the class in the midfield. I still, agree with a lot of the stuff that we said last time out. Just not a great race on their part here at Austria. So, I think we'll keep an eye on it and see if this continues as we, progress into some more races during this summer kind of swing here. But I don't think it will. I think Alpine is still the class in the midfield. And they didn't do anything, terrible in this race. They just didn't have the pace. So I think it's just kind of a track-specific thing for Alpine this week. And yeah, I still think, I have a lot of faith in them to be the class in the midfield this season when it's all said and done. But this weekend wasn't it for them. So I got to call that out. Obviously Williams as well. I think it was a tough weekend for them. It was tough for Audi to, be so close. Once again, they're still living in P11 and P12, it seems like this year. But I don't think any of that was, I just needed to call out Alpine, I think, for stinker of the week here. Just felt like it was, I just feel like they were a stinker. They flopped this week, I think, based on where they should have finished. So, yeah, that's everything for this week and this solo pod. We'll be back next week with Silverstone. Sam will be back here, so it'll be the two of us back again, chopping it up. I just had to go through everything because we had a pretty eventful race here. And yeah, we got 30 minutes in for a solo kind of thing here, so there was plenty to talk about. But yeah, I'll be happy to have Sam back next week and get that banter going once again. But we had to go through a lot of stuff here for Austria. But yeah, that'll do it. George Russell is your winner in Austria, climbs back to P2 in the championship, 40 points back. And we'll see where it goes from here at Silverstone. Super excited for next week. One of the best tracks on the grid, one of the best atmospheres on the grid as well, with F1 going to Silverstone. So yeah, that's it for this week. Super excited for next week. Like I said, Sam will be back, and we'll be back to more of your regularly scheduled programming. But thank you guys for listening and staying tuned in with this solo episode. But we'll be back next week, and see you guys next time.